Lenin's electoral strategy from Marx and Engels through the Revolution of 1905. The ballot, the streets, or both. August H. Nimtz. Contents. 1-1. 2. Revolutionary continuity, Lenin's politics prior to 1905-43. 3. The dress rehearsal and the First Duma 83. 4. From Revolution to Coup d'État, the Second Duma 127 Appendix A, excerpt from Address of the Central Committee to the Communist League 171 Appendix B, Sketch of a Provisional Revolutionary Government 175 Appendix C, Whom to elect to the State Duma 179 A Critical Review of the Relevant Literature 185. 3 years after the Bolshevik-led triumph in Russia in October 1917, Lenin declared that his party's participation in parliaments was not only useful but indispensable in its success. 1. If true, this means that the Russian Revolution was the first and only revolution in history to employ the parliamentary arena for working-class ascent to state power. But what exactly did Lenin mean by participation in parliaments? This book aims to answer that very question and in the process to understand and sustain the validity of Lenin's claim. The Bolshevik example offers, therefore, potentially rich lessons for today's protesters in whatever corner of the globe. Yearning for something more fundamental than what is often touted as change, many are torn between the streets and the ballot box for its realization. The solution Lenin fought for to this apparent dilemma was what he called revolutionary parliamentarism, the subject of this book. The book, which includes the companion volume, Lenin's Electoral Strategy from 1907 to the Revolution of October 1917, the ballot or the streets or both, makes 4 arguments. The first is that no one did more to utilize the electoral and parliamentary arenas for revolutionary ends than Vladimir I Lenin. The second argument is that Lenin's position on the streets versus the ballot box, no, it wasn't either or was squarely rooted in the politics of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Third, the historic split in international Marxism between communism and social democracy was long in place before the guns of August 1914 exploded, owing in large part to 2 very different conceptions of how Marxists should comport themselves in the electoral/parliamentary arenas, with Lenin on one side and what would become 20th-century social democracy on the other side. The last claim is that the Head Start program the founders of the modern communist movement gave Lenin on electoral politics goes a long way toward explaining why the Bolsheviks, rather than any other political current, were hegemonic in October 1917. To make my case I do the following. For the first argument, I extract and summarize from the entire Lenin corpus in print all his electoral activities, especially his leadership of the Bolshevik wing of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in the 4 state Dumas from 1906 to the beginning of the First World War. This is no easy task, since it's likely that on no other question apart from than that of the peasantry did Lenin spill so much ink. But it's doable because Lenin often reiterated the same claims for different venues. As for my argument that he was squarely rooted in Marx and Engels, I draw on my 2 earlier books on their politics. As many forests as have been felled for the Marxological industry, it is telling that this is the first synthesis of Marx and Engels's views on the electoral process. The Leninologists have also been derelict. 2 particularly striking about their enterprise is the almost complete absence of any sustained or, certainly, book-length discussion of Lenin's political kinship with Marx and Engels despite their frequent denial of such paternity. This book is, thus, a correction of 2 intellectual deficits. In the process, I show that no one of Lenin's generation understood Marx and Engels as well as he did. As for the argument about the roots of the historic split in international Marxism, I call in chronological order from Lenin's writings and actions his awareness of the growing disagreements and divide between him and Western European Marxists. The record reveals admittedly in hindsight that the formal split that took place when the First World War erupted was the culmination of a decade-long process. Finally, as for the so what question, what difference did it make that Lenin got Marx and Engels right, This book argues that there is enough circumstantial evidence to show that his electoral/parliamentary strategy was decisive in the Bolshevik-led triumph in 1917, probably the only revolution to have been realized in such fashion. This is, therefore, and surprisingly, given all that's been written about it, the first study to trace the connection between the politics of the two founders of the modern communist movement and the Russian Revolution. Though not a definitive explanation for the Bolshevik success, a tentative case given what's at stake in politics today is infinitely superior to none at all. Just ask the protesters in Tahrir Square. When I'd tell someone what I was working on while researching and writing this book, my words would often be greeted with a look of incredulity. Lenin's electoral strategy. That sounded oxymoronic. Such a reaction is not surprising. No figure in modern political history has been as misrepresented as Lenin. The reason is that not only his enemies but also many of his so-called friends are culpable. His enemies can easily justify their disdain simply on the basis of what has been done in Lenin's name for almost a century. 3. The Stalinist counter-revolution that replaced the rule of the proletariat with that of the bureaucracy, and all the accompanying horrors, has indeed enabled his enemies' ever-present campaign to fault Lenin for what occurred after his death. But that reading of Lenin can only be sustained if there is indeed evidence of a causal link between his actions and Stalin's crimes, that the latter followed the former and employed Lenin's name and corpse to justify what he did is no proof of Lenin's culpability. Lenin's more than decade-long work in electoral/parliamentary politics between 1905 and 1918 is inconvenient for his enemies, and that is why in almost Stalinist-like fashion it has been deleted in Leninological accounts. For Lenin's smarter enemies know that post hoc explanation is unpersuasive, hence their never-ending quest to find the proverbial smoking gun, some evidence that he parented Stalin. And if that can't be found, it can be invented. 5 others have been less brazen and mainly impugn Lenin by innuendo. Rather than clutter the text with a discussion of that constant campaign, I confine it largely to the section A Critical Review of the Relevant Literature. One enemy's effort, though, is worth pointing out here: Richard Pipes's The Unknown Lenin, from the Secret Archive. Because he was one of the first Western scholars granted permission to peruse formerly closed archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and owing to his renown as a Leninologist, Pipes's book was highly anticipated. If anyone could find the smoking gun, surely he could. But Pipes fired a dud, because the documents he reproduces from before the October Revolution contain no seed of the Stalinist counter-revolution. And one can be sure that if there was anything in that trove of documents that put Lenin, a thoroughgoing misanthrope, in a positive light, it didn't find its way into the Pipes selection. 6. For different reasons, Lenin's friends, both real and fictitious, such as the hagiographers in Moscow and their cheerleaders elsewhere, are also complicit in veiling the rich record this book unearths. In the conclusion to Lay 1917, I discuss what I call a conspiracy of silence by both foe and friend that helps make Lenin's electoral strategy sound so incongruous. Though this book isn't about the Stalinist counter-revolution, it's a matter that can't be ignored. Along with mention of Lenin's unsuccessful fight from his sickbed to arrest the development, I devote a few pages toward an explanation along with relevant facts about the Bolsheviks in power after the October Revolution at the end of Chapter 3 and in the conclusion in Lay 1917. Leon Trotsky's time-tested theory of Stalinism is what I employ. Lenin's second-in-command in the October Revolution, head of the Red Army in the Civil War, a witness to the counter-revolution and eventually one of its many victims, Trotsky argued that political contingency best explains what happened. In other words, the Stalinist outcome was no more preordained than were the counter-revolutions that overthrew radical Reconstruction after the U.S. Civil War or the Paris Commune in 1871. 7. There's no smoking gun to be found. I recognize there's no convincing Lenin's class enemies, like Pipes, of the truth. But for those who are willing to suspend judgment until learning about this hitherto ignored side of Lenin, I offer this advice: the same kind of historical perspective needed to make judgments about the American Revolution, both phases. The war for national liberation and the social revolution that overthrew slavery is also required for the Russian Revolution. Lest it be construed that only reactionary forces have disdain for Lenin, let me mention another crowd. The reader will probably be struck by Lenin's unsparing criticism of Russian liberalism and the Cadet Party, in particular the treachery of liberals, as he called it. At times he vented more anger at them than at the Tsarist regime. Inveterate apologists for the latter, the liberals almost always vacillated at critical moments in Russia's democratic quest. Because they tried to inculcate workers and peasants with their anti-revolutionary politics, Lenin constantly hammered on the difference between democracy and liberalism and made special use of election campaigns to that end. His scathing denunciation of Russian liberals has earned him no friends in the Liberal Academy. The forces in Russia they are likely to identify with, despite pretenses of being objective in their accounts about the Russian Revolution, proved to be just what Lenin predicted, hand-wringing prevaricators. And that Lenin was so accurate in his predictions about them is even more galling. Lenin, informed by the lessons Marx and Engels drew on the revolutions of 1848–49, read the politics of liberals better than any modern figure, and they've never forgiven him for it. I'm not sure I would have written this book had I not read many years ago Lenin as Election Campaign Manager, a 23-page pamphlet that, fortunately because it's still the best introduction to the topic and, thus, to this book, remains in print. 8 deep in my memory banks, it began to prick my consciousness a few years ago as I was reading a classic by a doyen of the Academy that claimed that working class participation in the electoral/parliamentary arena was inevitably compromising. According to political scientist Adam Przeworski, working class parties, because they represented a minority of the population, had to enter into coalitions with parties representing other social layers and, thus, had to attenuate their demands and pursue a reformist political course a la Western European social democracy. But I vaguely remembered a different scenario, the Bolshevik experience. I revisited the pamphlet and found what I was trying to recall: Lenin's argument that the Russian movement also heard the siren call of opportunism but didn't succumb, at least in its revolutionary wing. In a 2010 article, I critiqued Przeworski mainly for his dishonest treatment of Marx and Engels' views on electoral/parliamentary politics and concluded that until the Russian case had been looked at closely, his hypothesis must remain no more than that. 9. This book is that examination, and it refutes Przeworski's claim of the inevitability of reformism. In my book Marx and Engels, Their Contribution to the Democratic Breakthrough, I told readers that I'd address in a future volume what happened to their project after their deaths. 10. This book also constitutes the first belated, largely because of the rich database I had to mine, down payment on that promise. The chronological organization of the book, both this and the second volume, is dictated by its 4 arguments. In this volume, Chapter 1, provides the necessary evidence for the second argument, that Lenin's electoral/parliamentary strategy was squarely rooted in their politics. It distills and summarizes what the 2 founders of the modern communist movement said and did about electoral politics from the revolutions of 1848–49 to the fight against reformism Engels was engaged in at the time of his death in 1895. It ends with their judgments about the revolutionary prospects for Russia, also necessary in making a determination about Lenin's continuity with their program. Chapter 2, Revolutionary Continuity, Lenin's Politics Prior to 1905, seeks to understand how he responded when the first opportunity for electoral/parliamentary activity in Tsarist Russia presented itself. What were his views from the time he entered politics in 1894 to the beginning of the Russian Spring in 1905, on democracy in general, parliamentary democracy, constitutional government, and their relation to socialist revolution? And how did the democratic norm inform his views on the working class organizing itself into a party? Chapters 3 and 4 of this volume, and chapters 1 and 2 of Lay 1917, constitute the empirical heart of the book, the very rich details about the leadership Lenin provided for the RSDLP for the elections to and participation in the 4 state Dumas from 1906 to 1914. Issues such as whether to boycott or participate in undemocratic elections, how to conduct election campaigns, whether to enter into electoral blocks and the related lesser of two evils dilemma, how to keep deputies accountable to the party, and how to balance electoral politics with armed struggle all had to be addressed. And most important, how could the electoral/parliamentary process be utilized to forge a revolutionary coalition of the majority, the Worker-Peasant Alliance? Throughout the process, the often contentious issue of internal party politics, specifically 12. The growing split between the RSDLP's Bolshevik and Menshevik wings, looms large. That conflict, the evidence shows, mirrored the growing divide between revolutionary and reformist social democracy at the international level. This part of the narrative is framed by the Revolution of 1905, its defeat, the revival of revolutionary activity in 1912, and the outbreak of the First World War 2 years later. Chapter 3 in Late 1917, The Great War, 1917, and beyond, begins with the Bolshevik Duma deputies' response to the outbreak of the war, their arrest and trial, and the split in international social democracy. The February Revolution in 1917, the overthrow of Tsarist rule, allowed Lenin to apply the lessons of decade-long experience in the electoral arena, specifically, how to count one's forces to determine when the Bolsheviks should lead an armed uprising of Russia's proletariat to take state power. There is sufficient evidence, as this chapter reveals, to make a more than credible case that the Bolshevik-led revolution in October, under Lenin's direction, was very much informed by the electoral/parliamentary strategy of modern communism's two founders. The first reading of the October Revolution to show its roots in Marx and Engels. Lenin's October Revolution balance sheets lend credence to this claim. Last, in the conclusion in Late 1917, I begin with a summary of the chapters of each volume and then interrogate the book's four arguments to see if the evidence presented is convincing. I then offer an explanation for the silences in the literatures of foe and friend about Lenin's rich record in electoral/parliamentary politics. I end with a discussion of the potential relevance of Lenin's strategy of revolutionary parliamentarism for activists today in a variety of settings around the world. Lenin's voice is prioritized and not, as is all too frequent in Leninological accounts, the author's. His voice is heard more than my own in these chapters. Readers, I think, will be pleased with that decision as they learn what Lenin actually said as opposed to what is often attributed to him and understand why he is all too often silenced. Lenin's detractors' accounts of him assume the reader has not and will not read him in his own words. Otherwise they would take far more precautions, make more hedges, or be less categorical than any of them have. Here Lenin is allowed to speak for himself. Virtually every word between quotation marks in the text is that of one of the protagonists of the story, with the citation usually in reasonable proximity. If quotations come from the same writing, I provide the citation at the last one to minimize the number of endnotes. To avoid confusion with quoted material, I have refrained as much as possible from the all too common practice of employing scare quotes. 13. For Lenin's voice, I rely almost exclusively on the 1976 printing of V.I. Lenin, Collected Works, in 45 volumes, the English edition of the slightly more extensive Russian edition, which is now online at http://www.marxist.org/archive/lenin/works/cw/index.htm. For that reason I employ its spellings, such as cadets rather than cadets. I'm aware that not all that Lenin wrote is in print and not just the unpublished documents Pipes's aforementioned selection drew on. Lenin's wife Krupskaya reported that much of their archives had to be burned before they fled Finland at the end of 1907, no doubt including many documents related to the Second State Duma. 11. And then there are the gargantuan Krakow archives that Lenin and Krupskaya had to abandon when the First World War broke out, reported to dwarf the collected works by at least a factor of 10. 12. For some reason they have never found their way into print. They too are no doubt rich in relevant documents, especially about the Third and Fourth State Dumas. That I rely primarily on the collected works may for some readers raise a red flag. Shouldn't I employ other voices in a more even-handed way? First, the aim of this book is to present what Lenin actually said given the silences in other accounts. Relying on his collected works is the only feasible way to do that. Second, as for differing opinions on significant issues, the reader will see that Lenin, who was writing in real time, often copiously reproduced his opponent's views in his polemics in order to take them on. Unlike today, his audience had access to both sides of the debate, and I assume with some confidence, therefore, Lenin had to be faithful in quoting opponents. What I can't determine, admittedly, is what Lenin didn't quote. Yet as the reader will see, he had to be convincing to be effective, which meant addressing his opponent's arguments in good faith. Every so often in politics a moment occurs that suggests history in the making. Only Minerva's owl and, more encouragingly, students of history can make a definitive judgment. At the risk of sounding tempo-centric, the eruption that began at the end of 2010 in Tunis, and then Cairo, Madison, New Delhi, Tel Aviv, New York, Oakland, Athens, Madrid, and then back to New Delhi, nearby Dhaka, and later the improbable Nicosia, and now, as this is being written, Istanbul and Rio de Janeiro appears to be the long-expected breakthrough in the more than 3-decade-long lull in the global class struggle. And this time the axis had finally shifted from the long overburdened Third World to the long somnolent advanced capitalist world, especially its capital, the United States. Since it is in essence a response to one of those rare moments in the 250-year history of the 14. Capitalist mode of production, a global economic crisis. The last time the masses have gone in motion on a near global scale, we can have more confidence that this upsurge, despite its inevitable ebbs and flows, has staying power. Years of resistance, with all the learning opportunities that come with such challenges to business as usual, are on the agenda for the world's toilers. What is needed are those prepared to participate in and distill the lessons of those opportunities, like the 35-year-old Lenin in Russia's dress rehearsal of 1905. This book, along with all the unseen, unacknowledged efforts in every corner of the world, is offered to aid and abet the future Lenins to ensure that this moment will one day be the stuff of history. See Chapter 1. What Marx and Engels bequeathed. In the immediate aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, Lenin engaged in a heated debate with what would be the intellectual forebears of today's Social Democrats. He accused them, especially Karl, the one-time Pope of European socialism, of misrepresenting Marx and Engels' politics. Koski, he protested, has turned Marx into a common liberal. Has beaten the world record in the liberal distortion of Marx. One of particular concern was how, in Lenin's estimation, they portrayed Marx and Engels' views on parliamentary democracy and the related issue of involvement in the electoral arena. These were vital questions, he argued, that went to the very heart of the significance of what the October Revolution had just instituted, the process by which it was achieved, and the potential lessons for aspiring revolutionaries elsewhere. This chapter provides a synopsis of Marx and Engels' views on both themes from their earliest to final pronouncements. 2. I also include a summary of what they thought about the prospects for revolution in Russia. Knowing what Marx and Engels had to say about parliamentary democracy and the electoral arena allows for a determination whether or not Lenin was justified in his accusations. A review of what they thought about the Russian movement also answers the oft-debated question concerning whether Lenin constituted continuity with the two founders of the modern communist movement, at least for these issues. The European Spring. The revolutions of 1848–49 required that Marx and Engels address concretely and substantively for the first time parliamentary democracy and the electoral process. Like the participants in the Arab Spring. 2. They, along with other activists, had to grapple with all the questions that come with the overthrow of despotic regimes: how to do it, what to replace them with, and how to ensure that the previously disenfranchised are actually in power. Prior to the mid-century upheavals, Marx and Engels had certainly thought and written about the institution of democratic rule. The daily reality of absolutist Prussia, even in its more liberal domains where the two lived, the Rhineland, almost demanded that they do so. Marx's first political writings addressed the irritant of state press censorship he faced as a cub reporter. His realization that the most influential mind for his generation, George Hegel, offered no real solutions to Germany's democratic deficit propelled him on the road to communist conclusions. Constitutional monarchy, Hegel's proposal, was far from true democracy, the sovereignty of the people. 3. Rather than the world of philosophy, the study, he decided, of actuality or the real movement of history provided better results. And in the world as it existed when he set out to make his inquiries, history and actuality offered only 2 examples of political overturns that resulted in political democracy, France and the United States of America. The American case, I argue, generated the most valuable lessons for Marx. What was so striking about the U.S. experience for the young Marx was the combination of the most politically liberal society in the world with the grossest social inequalities, not the least of which was chattel slavery. For if that was the best that liberal or political democracy had to offer, then clearly something else was required for true democracy, or human emancipation. How do we explain this apparent contradiction? In seeking an answer, Marx arrived at conclusions that made him a communist. As long as inequalities in wealth, especially property, were allowed and reproduced political economy, then real democracy was impossible. The wealthy minority could and would use their resources to ensure political outcomes that privileged their interests. Then how could real democracy, a classless society, be realized, and what segment of society had the interest and capability to do so? Political developments in Europe provided the answer: the proletariat. Marx's new partner, Friedrich Engels, reached similar conclusions by another route. The task for the 2 new communists was to link up with Europe's vanguard proletarian fighters. The price for doing so, after winning key German worker leaders to their views, was to write a document that proclaimed their new worldview. The manifesto of the Communist Party sharply distinguished itself from the programmatic stances of other socialist tendencies in its position that the prerequisite for the socialist revolution was the democratic. 3. Revolution, the necessity to win the battle for democracy. In related pronouncements clarifying their views, they wrote that, like the Chartists in England, the German proletariat can and must accept the bourgeois revolution as a precondition for the workers' revolution. However, they cannot for a moment accept it as their ultimate goal. 5. In no uncertain terms, the manifesto, in 4 successive locations, made clear that it would take force to overthrow the bourgeoisie in order to reach the ultimate goal. Nevertheless, they maintained to the end that the means to that goal was the conquest of the bourgeois revolution. When a critic charged in 1892 that they ignored forms of democratic governance, Engels demurred. Marx and I, for 40 years, repeated ad nauseum that for us the democratic republic is the only political form in which the struggle between the working class and the capitalist class can first be universalized and then culminate in the decisive victory of the proletariat. 6. Communists for the bourgeois democratic revolution. The ink was hardly dry on the manifesto when the European spring erupted. On February 22, 1848, street fighting and the erection of barricades began in Paris. The monarch Louis-Philippe abdicated after 2 days and a provisional government was installed, the commencement of the Second Republic. The outcome in Paris inspired protests and uprisings in almost 50 other cities in Europe. A new phase in the age of the bourgeois democratic revolutions had opened the struggle to institute republican government and parliamentary democracy for the first time in most countries on the continent. In France, the fight was for its reinstitution. Armed with a party, the Communist League, the body that commissioned the writing of the manifesto, Marx and Engels immediately went into action. From Brussels, where they had been in exile, they moved to revolutionary Paris, where they made plans for realizing their new worldview in Germany. They had to move quickly, for on March 18, after 2 days of street fighting in Berlin, Frederick IV conceded to the demands of the demonstrators and agreed to grant a constitution. The manifesto, they recognized, needed to be supplemented given the new reality. Except perhaps for France, socialist revolution. What the document spoke to was not on the immediate agenda in most countries, certainly not their homeland. Thus they composed, with the approval of the central authority of the League, the much neglected demands of the Communist Party of Germany, effectively the extreme left position of the bourgeois democratic revolution. As a one-page leaflet it was disseminated. 4. Much more widely than the manifesto. The first 3 and 13th of the 17 demands are instructive. 1. The whole of Germany shall be declared a single and indivisible republic. 2. Every German, having reached the age of 21, shall have the right to vote and to be elected, provided he has not been convicted of a criminal offense. 3. Representatives of the people shall receive payment so that workers, too, shall be able to become members of the German parliament. 13. Complete separation of church and state. The clergy of every denomination shall be paid only by the voluntary contributions of their congregations. 7. As well as constituting what they considered to be the essentials of a democratic republic, these were Marx and Engels' first public pronouncements as communists on universal suffrage and representative democracy. The demands addressed another issue that the manifesto didn't: the peasant question. As the document stated, demands 6 through 9 are to be adopted in order to reduce the communal and other burdens hitherto imposed upon the peasants and small tenant farmers without curtailing the means available for defraying state expenses and without imperiling production. 8 other demands indicated that the document did indeed have a multi-class audience in mind. It is to the interest of the German proletariat, the petty bourgeoisie and the small peasants to support these demands with all possible energy. Only by the realization of these demands will the millions in Germany, who have hitherto been exploited by a handful of persons and whom the exploiters would like to keep in further subjection, win the rights and attain to that power to which they are entitled as the producers of all wealth. In other words, an alliance of the proletariat, petty bourgeoisie, and small peasant. What Engels referred to in earlier writings as the alliance of the people was the coalition Marx and Engels envisioned to win the battle for democracy, the bourgeois democratic revolution. Once back in Germany, the Rhineland in particular, Marx and Engels sought to implement their vision. The subhead of their new newspaper, the Neue Rheinische or NRZ, the Organ der Demokratie, said it all. But not all Communist League members and contacts were in agreement with the perspective of the demands. Regarding, first, the demand for a unified republic, Andreas Gottschalk, the League's leader in Cologne, objected on the grounds that such a call would frighten the bourgeoisie. A constitutional monarchy was less threatening, he argued. He also complained about the elections to the all-German Frankfurt Parliament and the Prussian Constitutional 5. Assembly in Berlin, because workers would be required to vote for electors and have, thus, only an indirect vote. The elections, he urged, should be boycotted. Marx and Engels and the rest of the League leadership disagreed and argued for active participation in the elections. Another difference of opinion concerned the coalition of class forces for instituting the democratic revolution, an issue that had implications for Marx and Engels' electoral strategy. Not only Gottschalk but another key figure in the workers' movement, Stephen Born, thought that priority should be given to issues that directly affected the working class and looked skeptically on an alliance with the petty bourgeoisie and peasantry. This stance, which Marx and Engels criticized, betrayed the tendency on the part of craft workers still saddled with a guild or Straubinger mentality to dismiss the importance of the democratic revolution, a kind of working class provincialism. To be sectarian toward these other social classes threatened the realization of that revolution, given that workers constituted a minority of society. Such a posture meant effectively conceding the franchise for that fight to the bourgeoisie, who, as Marx and Engels had already begun to point out, would increasingly vacillate on the issue of democracy. The differences of opinion that surfaced in the League pose the related question of democratic decision-making within the organizations that Marx led, an issue that can only be briefly treated here. Suffice it to say that in Gottschalk's case, owing to his disagreement with the League's leadership about its electoral strategy, he was asked to tender his resignation. One of its rules stipulated that subordination to the decisions of the League was one of the conditions of membership. He told Marx that he disagreed with the rule and would indeed resign because his personal freedom was in jeopardy. What transpired gives credence to the argument that the League's norms anticipated those that Lenin is most associated with, democratic centralism. Many years later Engels told a supporter in Denmark that the labor movement depends on mercilessly criticizing existing society. So how can it itself avoid being criticized or try and forbid discussion? Are we then asking that others concede us the right of free speech merely so that we may abolish it again within our own ranks? 10. There is no evidence that he and Marx ever acted contrary to this stance, including in the case of Gottschalk. It was his actions opposition to the League's electoral strategy and not his right to voice disagreement that were curtailed. It is not entirely clear from the extant historical record how the League participated in the initial elections to the Frankfurt and Berlin parliamentary/constituent assembly bodies in May 1848. 11. What is 6. known is that sometime in June, Marx, acting in his capacity as the organization's leader, decided to suspend activities in its name owing mainly to perceived political realities, an issue to be revisited shortly. In its place, the editorial board of the NRZ, with Marx in the lead, served as the effective body to carry out its perspective and organize its work. The axis of its activities, at times quite successful, was the effort to realize the alliance of the people, that is, the coalition of the proletariat, the peasantry and urban petty bourgeoisie, and the popularization of the demands. Virgin steps into the electoral arena. Just as in the Arab Spring, the course of the European Spring was impacted by developments in the neighborhood, and no country was more important in this regard than France, the Egypt of the revolutions of 1848 to 49. In hindsight, the bloody defeat of the working-class insurgents in Paris in June 1848 was the beginning of the end of the continental-wide upsurge, though, also in hindsight, it signaled the inauguration of the age of socialist revolution. The routing of the democratic forces in Vienna in October was the final nail in the coffin, but, again, only in retrospect, since it would be another half-year before it was clear that the democratic revolutions had been stillborn. Basically, what happened, Marx and Engels argued, is that the cowardly behavior of the bourgeoisie emboldened the reactionary forces. Ignoring whatever progress the deputies to the Prussian body had made in the constitution they were writing, Frederick IV decided to impose his own on December 5. It provided for a constitutional monarchy, granting him, thus, ultimate power. His coup d'état presented revolutionary forces with a dilemma, because his imposed constitution authorized elections for the new Prussian assembly. To participate or not to participate in the elections, and if so, how? For Marx, participation in the elections was obligatory. The only question was whether to vote for liberal bourgeois Democrats who would oppose the constitution, or put forward candidates representing the People's Alliance of Workers, Peasants, and the urban petty bourgeoisie, or abstain. He advocated for the first option. The Party of the People, in his opinion, was not strong enough to run its own candidates. It exists in Germany as yet only in an elementary form. 12. The principled stance, as he argued at a meeting of the proletarian component of the alliance, was opposition to feudal absolutism, that is, the imposed constitution. We are certainly the last people to desire the rule of the bourgeoisie. But we say to the workers and the petty bourgeoisie, it is better to suffer. 7. In modern bourgeois society, which by its industry creates the material means for the foundation of a new society that will liberate you all. Thus it was necessary to unite with another party also in opposition, so as not to allow our common enemy, the absolute monarchy, to win. 13. Even though opponents of the constitution won overwhelmingly in the Rhineland, its proponents in the rest of Prussia, with the backing of the bourgeoisie, were successful. The fact that big capital supported a document objectively against its interests confirmed unambiguously for Marx that the German bourgeoisie was incapable of acting in a revolutionary way. The opposition Rhineland vote, however, which was mobilized by the joint efforts of the working class and urban petit bourgeoisie organizations of the province, convinced the NRZ party that the potential for building the People's Party was better than ever. In the elections, the petty bourgeoisie, peasants, and proletarians emancipated themselves from the big bourgeoisie, the upper nobility and the higher bureaucracy. 14 About 3 weeks after the January elections, an opponent newspaper accused the NRZ tendency of having been duped by the Liberal Democrats, whom it supported on the expectation that they would oppose the Constitution, a hope that was quickly dashed. Marx's reply is instructive because it provides perhaps the first glimpse of his and Engels' approach to electoral politics in a concrete setting. After explaining why we put our own views into the background during the elections, he declared, "Now, after the elections, we are again asserting our old ruthless point of view in relation not only to the government, but also to the official opposition." 15 As for the charge of having been duped by the Liberal Democrats, it could be foreseen that these gentlemen, in order to be re-elected, would now recognize the imposed constitution. It is characteristic of the standpoint of these gentlemen that after the elections they are disavowing in the democratic clubs what before the elections they assented to at meetings of the electors. This petty, crafty liberal slyness was never the diplomacy of revolutionaries. 16 Thus the party of the people, while obligated, owing to the particular setting of mid-19th century Germany, to ally with the Liberal Democrats in the elections, should entertain no illusions about the latter and should take political distance from them as soon as the elections are concluded. A year later, to be seen shortly, Marx and Engels would distill and codify the revolutionary implications of this position by calling for complete working-class political independence from Liberal Democrats, specifically by running workers' candidates in future elections. 8. Lessons of struggle. With the European spring in full retreat and thus diminished political space, Marx and Engels withdrew from the battlefield. In London, they, along with other League members, sought to regroup and to plan their next moves. History would reveal that their most important work were the balance sheets that they drew on the preceding 2 years, the lessons of struggle. 3 documents/writings proved to have long shelf life. The address of March 1850. The first and most immediate task was to assess the performance of the League itself. As its re-elected head, Marx, with the assistance of Engels, wrote on behalf of the other leaders what has come to be known as the Address of the Central Authority to the League, March, 1850. A 10-page document, it is a concise distillation of many of the conclusions they had already reached based on what they had witnessed. What makes the document so significant for present purposes is that Lenin, who knew them by heart, according to the Bolshevik archivist David Ryazanov, used to delight in quoting them. 17 Employing them and the other balance sheets in the heat of Russia's 1905 revolution, a veritable laboratory of the class struggle, allowed Lenin to rightly see that in the activities of Marx and Engels, the period of their participation in the mass revolutionary struggle of 1848 to 49 stands out as the central point. This was their point of departure when determining the future pattern of the workers' movement and democracy in different countries. 18 The central theme of the address, again, based on the experience of the 2 preceding years, is that the working class had to be organized independently in the expected revival of the German Revolution. Independently or some variant appears on 9 of the 10 pages, sometimes more than once. The suspension of the League here Marx made an implicit self-criticism, led its members to dissolve themselves into the work of the broader democratic movement, and thus conceded unnecessarily leadership in the democratic revolution to urban middle-class Democrats. But the bourgeoisie's betrayal of the anti-feudal cause meant that in the revived revolution it was precisely those Democrats that the working class would have to ally with, a class, however, whose track record in the 2-year fight for democracy left much to be desired. Much of the document is about how to avoid another betrayal and what to do next following the successful overthrow of the feudal order, including preparation for armed struggle. The document stated repeatedly that a working class 9. alliance with the petit bourgeois democracy was just that, an alliance and not unity. Only the working class, independently organized, could provide the leadership needed to consummate the democratic revolution. and only then could the revolution in permanence be assured, that is, socialist revolution. The address proposed an electoral strategy, Marx and Engels' first detailed statement. In another implicit self-criticism of the stance that Marx took regarding the aforementioned elections to the Prussian Constituent Assembly in January 1850, Marx and Engels laid out a perspective designed to avoid the kind of betrayal that the liberal bourgeoisie had committed in the electoral arena. In the next elections to the National Assembly, workers had to pursue a course completely independent of not only the liberal bourgeoisie but the petty bourgeoisie as well. To be clear, what they outlined was a strategy for the post-feudal period where a degree of political democracy existed for the working class to contest elections. Most relevant are the instructions for the working class party. Hat everywhere workers' candidates are put up alongside the bourgeois democratic candidates, that they are as far as possible members of the League, and that their election is promoted by all means possible. Even when there is no prospect whatever of their being elected, the workers must put up their own candidates in order to preserve their independence, to count their forces and to lay before the public their revolutionary attitude and party standpoint. In this connection they must not allow themselves to be bribed by such arguments of the Democrats as, for example, that by so doing they are splitting the Democratic Party and giving the reactionaries the possibility of victory. The ultimate purpose of all such phrases is to dupe the proletariat. The advance which the proletariat party is bound to make by such independent action is infinitely more important than the disadvantage that might be incurred by the presence of a few reactionaries in the representative body. If from the outset the Democrats come out resolutely and terroristically against the reactionaries, the influence of the latter in the elections will be destroyed in advance. 19. The first sentence I've italicized makes clear, in no uncertain terms, that for Marx and Engels electoral victories were subordinate to independent working-class political action. Rather than the number of seats won, the test of an election for the working-class party was how much it revealed its real strength, their forces. Implicit here is an unarticulated way of how to count other than being elected. Related and just as important is how well the party conducted itself in the election. Did it truly lay before the public their revolutionary attitude and party standpoint? Also significant are the subsequent sentences, because they address the conundrum. 10. That would bedevil many a progressive and working-class party in the next century and afterward, the wasted vote and lesser of two evils dilemmas in the electoral arena. Marx and Engels asserted, again unequivocally, that the potential gains from independent working-class political action outweighed the risks of reactionaries being elected. As for what they meant by terroristically, one can only speculate, because nothing here or in subsequent pronouncements provides clarification. 3 notable balance sheets. Marx and Engels produced 3 other assessments of the 1848-49 events that make points relevant to this discussion. One has to do with how they saw universal suffrage, what it could and could not do. In a series of articles written in 1850 that came to be called Class Struggles in France, Marx drew a balance sheet on the French Revolution. He noted the fundamental contradiction of the political arrangements that came with the new provisional government and the constitution under which it governed. The fundamental contradiction of this constitution, however, consists in the following: the classes whose social slavery the constitution is to perpetuate, proletariat, peasantry, petty bourgeoisie, it puts in possession of political power through universal suffrage. And from the class whose old social power it sanctions, the bourgeoisie, it withdraws the political guarantees of this power. It forces the political rule of the bourgeoisie into democratic conditions, which at every moment help the hostile classes to victory and jeopardize the very foundations of bourgeois society. From the ones it demands that they should not go forward from political to social emancipation, from the others that they should not go back from social to political restoration. 20. The granting of universal manhood suffrage created an inherently unstable situation for the bourgeoisie that could jeopardize its interests. The fundamental incompatibility between the interests of labor and capital was aggravated by the newly obtained political rights of the working classes. But even with universal suffrage, the bourgeois character of the Constitution prevented the working class from going forward from political to social emancipation. 21. Implicit in Marx's argument is a crucially important distinction. The possession of political power through universal suffrage for the working class and its allies was not to be conflated with the actual exercising of that power for social emancipation. The latter would require inroads on the very foundations of bourgeois society, that is, private property, exactly what the Constitution prohibited. The fundamental contradiction, Marx 11. argued, was resolved in May 1850 when the National Assembly, representing the interests of the bourgeoisie, abolished universal suffrage. Alexis de Tocqueville, one of the body's leading lights, had characterized its rule, after the crushing of the Parisian proletariat in June 1848, as a parliamentary dictatorship. For Marx, it was the bourgeois dictatorship. 22. Marx put the actions of the Assembly in perspective. Universal suffrage had fulfilled its mission. The majority of the people had passed through the school of development, which is all that universal suffrage can serve for in a revolutionary period. It had to be set aside by a revolution or by the reaction. 23. For the revolutionary process, universal suffrage was means to an end, not an end in itself. The end of universal suffrage emboldened, as Marx had anticipated, Louis Bonaparte to end the Second Republic with his coup d'état in December 1851. In his well-known analysis of the coup written in 1852, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, Marx pointed out that any assessment of bourgeois democracy had to take context into account both in space and time, specifically continental Europe on the one hand and America on the other. In Europe in the middle of the 19th century, where capitalist relations of production were rapidly expanding along with the necessary class differentiation within feudal governmental forms, the republic was the governmental form that an insurgent bourgeoisie needed. In the United States, which lacked a feudal background and where class relations and thus the class struggle were still fluid and not fixed, the republic by the middle of the 19th century had come to embody the conservative form of bourgeois rule. Engels drew a balance sheet on the German Revolution also in a series of articles titled Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany. Although important gains, following mass working-class revolts in Berlin and Vienna in March 1848, were made in the convening of both the Prussian and all-German Constituent Assembly, respectively in Berlin and Frankfurt, both proved incapable of leading a fight to advance and thus save the revolution. As was true with the National Assembly in Paris, the middle-class reformers in the two bodies were more afraid of the masses in motion than the threat of the Prussian monarchy to end this brief democratic opening. Those in Frankfurt honestly but tragically believed that the writing of a democratic constitution, more liberal than what was produced in Paris, would be sufficient for instituting liberal democracy in Germany for the first time. Engels is unsparing in his criticism of them. These poor, weak-minded men, during the course of their generally very obscure lives, had been so little accustomed to anything like success, that 12. They actually believed their paltry amendments, passed with 2 or 3 votes majority, would change the face of Europe. They had, from the beginning of their legislative career, been more imbued than any other faction of the Assembly with that incurable malady, parliamentary cretinism, a disorder which penetrates its unfortunate victims with the solemn conviction that the whole world, its history and future, are governed and determined by a majority of votes in that particular representative body which has the honor to count them among its members, and that all and everything going on outside the walls of their house wars, revolutions, railway constructing, colonizing of whole new continents, California gold discoveries, Central American canals, Russian armies, and whatever else may have some little claim to influence upon the destinies of mankind is nothing compared with the incommensurable events hinging upon the important question, whatever it may be, just at that moment occupying the attention of their honorable house. 24. Engels's biting sarcasm gets to the heart of his and Marx's view of the legislative arena. While the parliamentary process was not to be ignored and could be of benefit for the revolutionary process, the developments that were decisive in understanding the course of history took place not within but rather outside its apparently hermetic walls, not the least important being revolutions. Marx's previously quoted comment about the fate of universal suffrage in the French upheaval, it had to be set aside by a revolution or by the reaction, is an instantiation of his claim. What's decisive, in other words, in the fate of the electoral process itself takes place outside its very parameters. No one, as we'll see, identified as much with this position as did Lenin. Parliamentary cretinism came to be his favorite label for those who failed to understand this basic political truth. A new era in the class struggle. The end of the European Spring in 1849 resulted in a more than decade-long lull in revolutionary politics in that part of the world. While Marx and Engels, in their new residence, closely watched British politics and made occasional comments about its electoral arena, it was only in 1863, when Marx declared that the era of revolution has now fairly opened in Europe once more, that they would not only engage in a sustained discussion about the electoral arena but actually act to shape it in the interest of the working class. 25 Presciently, Marx, speculating on the outcome of the German Revolution, said at the end of 1848 that its fate was tied to the successful outcome of the worldwide revolutionary process that combined national liberation and anti-feudal end. 13. Anti-capitalist struggles waged in Canada as in Italy, in East Indies as in Prussia, in Africa as on the Danube. 26. Armed with a global perspective, he accurately recognized in 1860 the importance of two developments that foreshadowed a resurgence of the class struggle in Europe: the attack of the abolitionist John Brown on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and the abolishment of servitude by the Russian Tsar. Ending slavery and other pre-capitalist modes of exploitation was essential for the democratic revolution, a prerequisite for labor's struggle against capital. The International Working Men's Association. If there is one thing Europe's working classes learned once the U.S. Civil War was underway, it was that their governments did not represent their interests, particularly when it came to foreign policy. This was especially true for British workers. London, beckoning to the call of the textile barons and their need for southern cotton, took the side of the slave owners and threatened to intervene on their behalf. Despite the fact that textile workers in their thousands lost their jobs owing to the northern blockade of ships taking southern cotton across the Atlantic, they instinctively and consciously mobilized to support the anti-slavery cause and oppose London's threats. Workers increasingly recognized that they had to have their own foreign policy. This exigency was one of the factors that led to the founding in 1864 of the International Working Men's Association, the first international. From the beginning, Marx, who had already lobbied in the press on behalf of the Northern cause, played a key role in the new organization as the representative of the German workers and soon emerged as its effective leader. The central message of the founding document he wrote, Inaugural Address, was that while a reform such as the British Parliament's limiting the workday to 10 hours was a victory for the working class, the lords of land and the lords of capital will always use their political privileges for the defense and perpetuation of their economic monopolies. They will continue to lay every possible impediment in the way of the emancipation of labor. To conquer political power has therefore become the duty of the working classes. 27. What this meant and how it would be implemented would take another 7 years before it was concretized. In the meantime, the main task was to ensure the survival of the organization. Instrumental in doing so, it earned for Marx the moral authority needed for that moment. In the second foundational document of the IWMA, also written by Marx, Provisional Rules of the Association, the other central message that 14. guided its work was stated at the very beginning: emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. 28. The key lesson of the 1848 revolutions weighed heavily on Marx's brain when he wrote this. Unlike that of the inaugural address, this message was given force and executed within weeks of the organization's founding. After more than a month of working with some of the petit bourgeois figures on the General Council, the executive committee of the IWMA, Marx told Engels that one has to be all the more careful the moment men of letters, members of the bourgeoisie or semi-literary people become involved in the organization. 29. To address that concern, Marx initiated organizational norms that severely limited middle-class participation in the IWMA leadership. When a prominent lawyer who had collaborated with it sought a seat on the GC, Marx convinced other members to reject his request. I believe him an honest and sincere man. At the same time, he is nothing and can be nothing save a bourgeois politician. Exactly because the lawyer aspired to a seat in Parliament, he ought to be excluded from entering our committee. We cannot become le pedestal for small parliamentary ambitions. Others of his class will follow, and our efforts, till now successful at freeing the English working class movement from all middle class or aristocratic patronage, will have been in vain. 30 From its commencement, therefore, Marx opposed any attempts to turn the International into an electoral conduit for, certainly, the petty bourgeoisie and bourgeoisie itself. Whether and how to make it into such a vehicle for the proletariat was a discussion and debate that eventually would take place. With its headquarters in London, the IWMA could not avoid the electoral arena. 6 months after its founding, the GC, with Marx's support, helped to found the Reform League, the working-class organization that played a key role in pressuring Parliament to enact the 1867 Reform Act, which extended the suffrage to the middle class and parts of the better-off workers. At Marx's urging, the GC had agreed that it would only support the demand of universal manhood suffrage. A year later, however, he reported that 2 of the GC's trade unionists, Kremer and Auger, have both betrayed us in the Reform League, where they came to a compromise with the bourgeoisie against our wishes. 31 The 2 gave in to the liberal bourgeois elements in the League who would only support household and not universal suffrage. Not only was the GC's perspective compromised by Kremer and Auger, but the fledgling organization's own agenda suffered as a result of the time and energy that its members devoted to League activities. At the beginning of 1871. 15. Marx wrote to a former Chartist leader who he still had relations with, I regret saying, most of the workmen's representatives use their position in our council only as a means of furthering their own petty personal aims. To get into the House of Commons by hook or crook, is their ultima thule, and they like nothing better than rubbing elbows with the lords and M.Ps by whom they are petted and demoralized. 32 What Marx witnessed was the labor movement, or to be more precise, its leadership subordinating the interests of the proletariat to those of the bourgeoisie. The International would have to institute explicit policies to prevent that from happening again. A possible alternative to the class collaborationist tendencies in the labor movement was what was being instituted in Germany. Beginning in 1862, the workers' movement, centered in Berlin and Leipzig, stirred anew after a decade of hibernation. Owing to his activist past in the 1848 events as well as his ties to Marx and Engels, Ferdinand Lassalle was asked by the workers to lead the fledgling body, the General Association of German Workers, founded in May 1863. However, his help came with a price: the insertion of ideas and a mode of functioning that were antithetical to the interests of independent working-class political action. While Marx and Engels waged a relentless campaign against his influence in the German workers' movement after his death in 1864, he was mortally wounded in a duel they had to be careful in taking him on during his brief tenure as the movement's leader in order not to throw out the baby, the first truly German workers' association, with the bath-water of Lassalleanism. A year earlier, after a visit from Lassalle, Marx had concluded that there was no basis any longer of a political partnership with him, since all we had in common politically were a few remote objectives. 33 Aside from the fact that he gives himself all the airs of a future working men's dictator, Marx objected to his panaceas for the social emancipation of the German proletariat, among which was universal suffrage and Prussian state socialism. As Marx sarcastically noted to Engels, the workers are to agitate for general suffrage, after which they are to send people like himself into the Chamber of Deputies, armed with the naked sword of science. 34 Again, Marx was sober about universal suffrage. He also objected to Lassalle's proposal that they organize workers' factories, for which the state advances the capital and, by, these institutions spread throughout the country. 35 Despite its deformed birth, the General Association of German Workers was the best the German working class had to offer, and from afar Marx and Engels sought to shape its development. 16. And the larger German workers' movement. A successful breakthrough came in 1869 with the formation of an alternative that they helped to nurture, the Social Democratic Workers' Party. It was able to win 2 seats held by August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht in the Reichstag, the best example of independent working-class political action. In addition to the class collaborationists, there was another tendency in and around the IWMA that Marx and Engels had to confront the anarchists. Under the influence of Mikhail Bakunin, they basically disagreed with what was implicit in the central messages of the founding documents of the International that Marx had written, namely, that the working class should employ the political arena as a means for its emancipation. What was implicit, Marx increasingly realized, would have to be made explicit. After the victory of the Union over the slavocracy in the United States, the most important political event in the history of the International occurred in Paris in the spring of 1871 when the working class rebelled and held power for almost 3 months. The Commune. Marx's most enduring contribution to the Communards was his The Civil War in France, published within a month of its demise on behalf of the IWMA. As well as a defense of the insurgents, it provides an analysis of what took place and distills the most important lesson of the Commune. After quoting from the manifesto that the Commune's Central Committee issued to justify its actions on March 18, the proletarians of Paris have understood that it is their imperious duty and their absolute right to render themselves masters of their own destinies, by seizing